I have some good news for those of you who are being depressed by social media. You're not alone. Turns out, social media is making lots of people depressed. I know, shocker. But it's another new study to come out in Computers and Human Behavior. It was published last month. And what it did is that they had suffered a big Freudian slip there. They surveyed 320 participants living in China, specifically in Wuhan, China. That was the site of the coronavirus outbreak, the epicenter, about how they accessed and shared health information with friends, family members, and colleagues over China's popular social media app, WeChat. Now, they also used a stress scale to measure anxiety and depression by asking participants to rate statements such as, "I felt that life was meaningless," and "I had disturbing dreams about coronavirus." So, yeah, they were asking some specific questions. Now, Bu Zong, journalism professor at Penn State and co-author of this study, said the team began looking into the effects of social media use on people's mental health right after Wuhan was locked down to curb the spread of the coronavirus. He said, "We didn't expect that this would become a global pandemic. We were just thinking that we could reveal some invisible harms caused by the outbreak that were not readily apparent." Of course, things like whether or not, you would be depressed staying indoors. I think that's fairly obvious that most people would be. And, what you would do with your time. You spend it on Facebook, spend it on Twitter, all these different social media apps. And of course, with those apps having all sorts of information overload, misinformation, disinformation, how that would play on somebody's mental health. And of course, I think we already pretty much know the answer, that it's a deleterious effect. Nonetheless, it is interesting they looked at it. So they give you more information here about this. Apparently in China, big shocker, local media was not doing reports on COVID-19. Fascinating. You think they would be. But they said, let's see, if you just read the local newspaper and watched television, you didn't get any information about the virus. This made people extremely stressed, and they began relying overwhelmingly on social media, which, of course, as I mentioned before, disinformation, misinformation, and that can have a serious problem in the discourse. Now, previous research also showed that more people were relying on social media to find and share their health information during this time. There was a Harris poll that found between late March and early May, 46 to 51% of American adults reported using social media more often than before the pandemic. And again, I think it was mainly because, well, we were locked in the house and information was hard to come by. And so, again, that can have, good effects, bad effects. Okay. Now, the study found that more than half of all participants, none of whom reported any traumatic or depressive disorders before the pandemic, experienced some level of depression. Nearly 20% of participants reported experiencing a moderate to severe level of depression, and slightly more than 20% reported moderate to severe levels of secondary trauma. So, okay, they experienced, again, half of all people were like, yeah, this kind of sucks. Pandemic, being stuck in the house, that blows. All right? Nearly 20% said, boy, things are getting bad, real bad. And generally, if you're locked into the news, you would tend to report that because the news is nothing more than pretty negative. And then secondary trauma. Now, what's secondary trauma? Apparently, you can get really depressed and upset when you hear about traumatic experiences of others. So, look, I can relate. I was reading early reports about what COVID-19 could potentially do to the human body and what it was like to, have to be on oxygen and gasping for air and things like that. That, it hits you hard. And you're like, Jesus, that's horrible. And so, yeah, secondary trauma when you read about how bad it could be and people that have survived, right? And so I get it. But based on the researchers' model, excessive use of social media, they found, was linked with the most severe levels of depression and secondary trauma. And I can confirm, again, every time I'm on social media, I get a little depressed. Mainly when I read the comments, though. At least the comment section on COVID. Oy. Especially with the local news. Even worse. So, but on a more serious note, yeah, of course people are going to get depressed. When you hear and see a lot of negative things, which is driven by algorithms to get clicks, yeah, you're gonna see bad things. You're gonna feel bad things. Feels bad, man. Definitely, I get it. Now, those algorithms are set up in the way that news is, unfortunately, and if it bleeds, it leads. That's one, unfortunate thing about our news cycle, and I get it. And look, I've had friends that have decided that, they were going to take some time out away from social media because after a while, it gets to be too much. It gets to be too much for everybody. And so, you got to take some time out. You got to do a little self-care. All right? But that said, they didn't find all negative news. At the same time, Zhang said it was important to understand how all types of social media, including platforms like Facebook and Twitter, can help people during a health crisis. And so understand, Twitter originally was really, really good at organizing social movements. People would organize on Twitter around Occupy Wall Street originally, and other, social movements like that. Social media has been really good for spreading videos like, for example, police brutality. Yes, it's a negative thing, but it also gets that in the limelight, and it also gets, in some cases, can lead to getting justice. And so there are positive facets to social media. It's just what it comes down to, according to the results of this study, is that you've got to take time out for you, and you've got to do, basically take time out for yourself, do things in moderation. And that's really it. And that's key. In fact, here's what Zhang said. I think when disasters find us, we tend to go to our social networks more to get help and reach out. It's human nature. We don't want people to think social media is bad. We just want them to know there's a balance. And when you go over the threshold, like checking every 5 to 10 minutes, like a lot of us in news media were, when Donald Trump went into the hospital with COVID, yes, I'm guilty of that. It can bring even more stress to yourself. And so overall, common sense, moderation, give yourself some time away from social media, process the bad things that you've seen, and do some self-care. Treat yourself. Treat yourself. Now, researchers say that it was possible, by the way, that people who consumed more health information on WeChat attached excessive importance to the content, experiencing more depression and secondary trauma than those who used the platform less. In response, they recommend social media breaks during stressful health crises. Quote, we should not blame social media. We should just pay attention to how we're using it. And look, I'll add, you might want to pay attention who is saying what over social media, especially here in America, especially here when it comes to platforms like Facebook and YouTube as well. All of them, really. Because there are places that push disinformation. You have Fox News for television. You've got PragerU on YouTube and Facebook. You've got places like Daily Wire. You've got to follow the money on those groups because a lot of them do push disinformation and a lot of fear. And that can have very negative effects on your mental health as well. So, turns out, conservatives, bad for your mental health. If you enjoyed this video, please give us a like and share with your friends. You can subscribe and help out the channel by becoming a patron. It's patreon.com/Jeff Waldorf, or you can become a channel member as well by hitting the join button below.